Hey, still sick, unfortunately. Not recording this from a live stream, not wearing pants, etc. There were a few things that I wanted to talk about, though, and it will just be me. No accompanying video or article. I wanted to talk about the threats that we face and what we can do about them. When I say we, I mean Americans. When I say the threats we face, I mean the ongoing and rapidly escalating attempt by the Republican Party to subvert our democracy and regress us into a fascist dictatorship. Um, I have received some criticism over the past few weeks for what is, in my opinion, a fair assessment of the severity of this threat. The upcoming, I've talked about this, the Supreme Court case that would allow state legislators ultimate authority over deciding the nature of elections conducted within the state's borders could mean the end of democratic federal and state government, at least within red states, if passed, and Republicans are willing to act on it, which they will, because the Republican Party basically fully supported Donald Trump, even up to and through January 6th, and continues to this day to either deny that it was a bad thing or to promote the conspiracy theory that Joe Biden actually lost the election and January 6th was an attempt to right that wrong. I think the threats are valid. I think I can be criticized fairly for not um, prescribing good solutions to these problems. I think it's a little bit high minded to say that anything I'm about to say is a solution. If I could provide a solution to catastrophic political problems like that, then I would probably be more than a YouTuber. But look, I wanted to talk really important I wanted to talk quickly about something that I think is really important, okay? And it's keeping an appropriate mindset when facing really serious problems, you know? I want to relate the struggle that a lot of American progressive and leftists are feeling to one of the most tenacious creatures on Earth, the fascist. Like a cockroach, you see, they have a remarkable ability to weather hardship and to appear when you least expect them. Imagine the history of America over the past century as a history from the eye of a fascist. This would be a very, very negative history from their perspective. Jim Crow being repealed, the Civil Rights Amendment, gay marriage being passed, trans people being more accepted, by a bunch of metrics that fascists really care about, things have gotten better for, well, the world, and therefore worse ideologically for them. Um, Now, in spite of all this, they have been persistent in infiltrating, police organizations, political organizations, biding their time waiting. They have been politically active and insistent the entire way through. That's because while there is a doomer streak that runs through fascism, it's a doomer streak that is designed to promote radical action. The messaging from fascist media personalities. I mean, you anything from Tucker Carlson all the way down to like the Stormfront boards is always we're on the precipice of losing everything. What will you do, white man? And of course, this language routinely inspires people to commit acts of mass murder or get into politics and thus indirectly commit acts of mass murder, um, which is, again, by their standard, a kind of productivity. I guess what I'm saying is that in spite of hardship, there is a tendency on the part of fascists to remain persistently awful. And I feel like a lot of leftists kind of are really tempted to throw in the towel. I don't know what it is about the difference in messaging, but it seems like you can have a continuous increase in progressive values, like just nonstop, just in every way, acceptance of interracial marriage, acceptance of, immigrants, acceptance of interracial neighborhoods, acceptance of queer people of all kinds, up about for decades and decades. Progressives have overcome so many like bad hills before. The whole AIDS crisis, the Ronald Reagan administration refusing to comment on the AIDS crisis, telling the CDC not to study it. Like all that, and then like we see a bunch of hardship on the road, and people are like, "That's it, I guess." And not to say that that response can't be a valid one. It's an understandable reaction. It's just it's important to understand what can be done because I feel like a lot of people, especially on the left, where attitudes towards electoralism are mixed, you tend to get a lot of unproductive negativity, what I call doomerism. I think that negativity is actually a perfectly rational way of thinking right now. I don't think doomerism is. So I wanted to talk about what we can do, and I'll stammer on about it no longer. It's all well and good to say, la revolution, and fire your cowboy six shooters into the sky, to sort of ethnically confuse things, the people around you, while you're doing the cowboy bit with the French. You can do that if you want. Sorry, can you tell that I'm sick? Um, Look, learn the arguments, learn to protect yourself, and organize. I'm a rhetorician. It's my job to talk and make arguments. So for that reason, I prioritize this section highest of all. We need to understand, and by we here I mean leftists and progressives, that the big threats, the revocation of our democracy, the tyranny, the massive attack on trans rights and what have you, um, these things are supported by Republicans broadly, but fully understood only by a minority of them. Most citizens just don't know that much about political causes, even the ones they directly support. And I really do think that a lot of Republicans right now, the voters, I mean, not the elected officials, have an attitude towards trans people which is less one of open repulsion, disgust, and hatred, which is basically what the mainstream Republican media attitude is, considering the fact that the past couple months have been, you know, riddled with the messaging that trans people are all groomers attacking your children, they're all pedophiles, what have you. Um, but I really do think that a lot of Republicans have the kind of love the sinner, hate the sin attitude towards trans people, this kind of compassionate disapproval. That's not to say that's an acceptable reaction, only that it's not the same as open, like, genocidal hatred. And I obviously don't have any strict numbers on this, but if you go, for example, by general polling, the majority of Americans are in favor of trans acceptance. If you look within the Republican Party, oftentimes on single issues, when polled, people are more split than you might think. Republicans vote as a coalition for a variety of reasons, not just because of the of their shared seething hatred of trans people. That being said, it's a large crowd being roped around by a small group, and the small group, the people who are elected or who represent media organizations who talk about trans people like an existential threat. You have Jordan Peterson and Matt Walsh essentially saying they don't think it should be legal to be trans at all. I think these people are, Pied Pipers. They're leading around a larger group. And while it would be pretty naive of me to suggest that it's possible to just like wake up the moderate Republicans to get them like out of there, like say, hey, like the people you're following are supporting genocidal rhetoric. I don't know if that's really possible, at least not for a large group of people. It's not a reliable process. I think what is a reliable process, though, is making the trans issue more of a difficult topic for Republicans to promote, to lead people around by. That is to say, right now we need to focus on doing to trans issues what the passage of the Civil Rights Act did to a lot of race issues, which is it makes the worst bigots grumble and fold their arms and stay quiet for a bit, because it suddenly becomes socially unacceptable for them to continue propagating their politics in the worst possible way. We need to revert in that respect slightly. And I think that you can do that when talking with moderate Republicans, because I've had so many convos with and had seen so many people online who are Republican voters who are like, wow, things have gotten a little bit wacky um, lately with regards to the trans issues, haven't they? In fact, I recently got a DM from somebody who said that they disagreed with my alarmist perspective on Florida's Say Gay bill, but then they messaged me just a few days ago saying like, oh, I think you might have been right about the Republicans messaging broadly, where I really hope that you're not right, but like, yeesh. And that's an admirable attitude, not only because it's tough to admit that you've changed your mind, but also because it's indicative of the fact that it is in fact possible to get people moved away from this. So to summarize it, okay, there are three basic arguments that are employed against trans people by the ultra far right that are used to kind of stir up this sentiment with the broader right. And it's simply this: trans people hurt themselves, trans people hurt others, and trans people hurt society. Okay? So there are ways to address all three of these basic arguments. For the idea that trans people hurt themselves, this is usually cited in the idea that trans people are victims of a gender cult that convinces them to mutilate their bodies, and it makes them suicidal. Now, thankfully, literally all available data on this subject proves the opposite of this. That the number of detransitioners is really quite uncommon. The majority of people who do detransition do so because they can't afford to continue transitioning, or because they face so much social backlash that they decided to just essentially keep in the closet, which is awful. Um, so that disproves that, as effectively as can be. If people say, even one detransitioner is enough to make all trans people, nobody should get the surgery. Well, that's an argument against literally all elective surgeries. All elective surgeries, surgeries that you choose to get, as opposed to, you've been rushed into the hospital because you've been shot through the shoulder or something, um, have a regret rate. And regret rates for trans surgeries are in line with or lower than many other elective or cosmetic surgeries. I don't believe trans related surgeries are cosmetic, though I do think that, especially in the case of stuff like facial feminization surgery, it certainly involves the effort of aestheticians and cosmetic surgeons. At any rate, the data supports that case, as does the data support the idea that trans surgeries or social transition or anything like that helps trans people emotionally. Um, as to the idea that people who are trans are all being groomed into a gender cult, that's a non-falsifiable claim. It's the same claim that was made against gay people and still is today. The idea that the only reason a person could ever be like that is because of abuse. If you want to counter that, you could point out the fact that gender divergent people, by our standard, not only exist around the world today, but have existed in many historical texts going back. You can literally find thousands of years old social systems that were more accommodating of gender divergence in that respect, at least, than the modern West with its gender binary is today. If or to put it another way, if you genuinely want to believe this non-falsifiable claim that every single one of the millions and millions of homosexuals and transsexuals out there are only what they are because of abuse, and this has been going on for literally all of human history, at that point, what you really would want to do then would be to limit abuse. Not not like fight against trans people, you know what I mean? Like at that point you're not even arguing against the concept of trans people. You've invented a boogeyman suggestion in your head, and then you're suggesting that its existence must then prove some other entirely separate thing. I suppose that all the cultures and throughout history that have had third genders, or all the Native Americans, like just every single person in their society had been groomed into that. Whatever. It's a ridiculous claim. You can make fun of it. Um, there are plenty of other very relevant statistics that can be pulled up, like the idea that parental support can decrease the likelihood of suicidal ideation with young trans people by like to 1/17th of what it would be otherwise. Like if you have a 17% rate of suicidal ideation within the past 3 months of a trans youth, parental support could drop that to 1%. I just made up the 17% number there, but I believe 1/17th was the statistic cited by that document. I think I have that in my research document, which I really need to update, by the way. So yeah, trans people, by virtue of being trans, the things associated with them being trans, that doesn't hurt them. As for whether or not they hurt others, we still have like no evidence at all that trans people pose a sexual risk to others. The idea that their inclusion in bathrooms of their choosing are going to hurt others, despite years of fear mongering by Republicans and conservatives worldwide and their turf stooges. We just really don't have any evidence of that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, just there's just there's just not evidence of it. Right now, they're going on about the whole, like, they're grooming the children thing. But again, like, you can point this out, and the data suggests it. First of all, sex education reduces the rate of child abuse because the young people then have the tools and awareness to understand what is being done to them if they're being abused, like how to describe it, and that it's unacceptable. If a young person has never even heard of anything related to sex and they start being sexually abused by a relative, they don't really have a way of knowing, at least not innately, that what's happening to them is bad or abusive because they haven't been told that it is. It's generally a good thing to educate children to like make them aware of when they're being hurt by others. It's just a good rule in general. Of course, the primo spots for abusive children are the church and the home. Any place where there are respected professionals, and elders and people in positions of authority, who sort of loom over them and have enough community acceptance to abuse and exploit in the pursuit of harming children. The idea that there's a mass of children who are being molested as a product of like drag shows is again non-existent. In every argument that I've ever had or seen on this subject, this is when the right starts to bust out like cosmically bizarre arguments, like really asinine, like magical thinking, like, okay, well, maybe all the data is in your favor and I have no data to support my case, but what if I invent this one magical thing? I invent a new bad thing and I say it's bad, and then we assume that it's happening there. What then, huh? That one guy that I debated, that Alex Stein guy, did this with the sexual confusion thing, where he thought that it was like molestation if a kid saw a drag queen, because later that kid might realize that they were attracted to a guy. I think that Alex Stein there was either projecting some weird childhood experiences or just making it up as he went along. But remember, laughing at people who make arguments like this is a core part of rhetoric. If a person makes an argument that is laughable, you have a right, no, an obligation to laugh at them. That is something you should definitely do. Because these arguments often are laughable, as are the arguments that trans people hurt society broadly. Leaving aside the fact that the existence of people outside the binary has been a constant throughout human history in various places and times. The idea that society is hurt by the existence of and acceptance of a minority group has been the calling card reactionary argument for literally every kind of social acceptance. They did it with black people, they did it with Mexicans, they did it with Chinese people, they did it with Native Americans, they did it with the Italians, they did it with the Irish, they did it with the German and Polish even further back then. They've done it with the gay people. They've done it with the trans people. They've done it with the everything. They do this every time. How am I supposed to explain to my kid when they see two men kissing in a park? I don't care. Yeah, I don't care. Good luck. Your kid probably gets it automatically. Kids, and in a lot of ways, kids actually are like more understanding and stuff like this because the brain damage that Republicans have to learn hasn't yet been ingrained in them. Like an adult Republican can see like can see like a trans woman go like, how my entire life I've been using she her to refer to a person's gametes, but now this society is being thrown into chaos by the existence of this they sure they look like a woman and everyone treats them like a woman, but are not the fabric of our society being torn asunder by. And then a kid will just go like, I, and that's it, because their idiot like child brain hasn't yet like absorbed all of the misinformation like a sponge. Yeah, obviously it gets more specific than this, but please remember that a healthy dose of ridicule is usually the most effective argument against transphobes because their arguments are so consistently self-defeating and irrational. You can get advanced, like pulling out the whole, well, what is a chair? Or, what is water? Like, what is a river? Like Wittgensteinian type semantic arguments if you want, because a lot of their positions are like epistemically indefensible. But I don't even think you have to go that far most of the time. And as for like besides trans people, and by the way, the reason I harp on trans people here isn't just because they're like the minority flavor of the month. What's happening in the Republican Party right now is undeniably fascist. And if we are to face off against an attempted fascist coup, we must understand the way fascism works. And fascism, unfortunately, requires a Jew group. We say this because the Nazis chose the Jews, but in reality, the idea of any kind of pervasive, degenerate, society eroding, group of educated elites who are trying to corrupt your children and blah, blah, blah. Like, they always need that. They need that archetype. I think trans people are occupying that archetype right now. I'm sure there are plenty of people in the GOP who do wish they could just go after Jews, but they have to keep up the whole Zionist Israel occupy the Holy Land so that the Christian fundamentalists get their rapture deal. So it's conflicting messaging there. Um, it's important to go like through this because like if you look at the way Republican messaging has evolved, it's pretty clear that what they want the majority of their followers to believe is that the existence of trans people poses like a critical threat to America that if left unchecked will lead to the grooming of your children, the destruction of the American like way of life, and so on and so on. This is of course nonsensical. It's ridiculous, and it is literally like what every white nationalist fascist Nazi group does and says. You can swap the groups if you want. Nazis tend to prefer Jews, but this stuff happens all over the world. It's a really common pattern. So, an effective way at pulling moderate Republicans would be to point out the silliness of these arguments, because really a lot is riding for the Republicans on their ability to convince their following that this hysteria is legitimate. So, don't let them. I think it's also worthwhile to make arguments about the validity of democracy when arguing with moderate Republicans. Though the Jan 6 trials, January 6th, a lot of this stuff feels pretty like, I don't know, settled. It was something like half of Republicans believe Jan 6 was like justified or something like that, which does, to be fair, mean that half think it was unjustified. And half is a lot. I mean, that's a good part of the Republican Party. The January 6 hearings have done a pretty good job of laying out the extent to which the Trump administration lied. I mean, like on every possible level, like essentially beyond parody. How Trump was proven wrong at every step in the process of attempting to undo a democratic election, shown to have been lying, and persisted anyway. So familiarizing yourself with stuff like that and like explaining it all patiently to your dawdling boomer Republican relatives, maybe not a bad idea. I know it's embarrassing that you have to do that because it's all like highly publicized public record, and they're like voting for these people, so they should know better, but they don't. So, okay. Um, you should also learn the arguments against liberals, by the way. Right now, one of the major reasons we're in this position is because the Democrat Party is just completely unwilling to use its power to stop what could be like a literal end to our democracy. The DOJ could be doing so much more work in mass arrests against Republicans who are complicit in the attempted overturn of our democracy on January 6th, and there's a hell of a lot more that could be done to hamper the Supreme Court today as they continue to undo our rights with every new judgment they arrive at. But they don't. Unfortunately, there are many liberals who are of the opinion that, they take the low road, we take the high road. Abstemiousness will bring us victory in the end. Virtue is its own reward. Everything will work out in the end. And of course, it won't. Yeah, no. You can take a look at whether you want like Italy or Nazi Germany or Japan or Spain. Less so Japan, because they didn't lead into where they were from a liberal democracy. But nonetheless, always there's this attitude like things will be okay. Sure, the things may seem scary, but at the end of the day, the good guy always prevails. And historically, this is just delusional. Republicans are right now as evident as can be that they are going to break the rules and take control of the system. And it is not appropriate to look at that and to go, oh, yeah, well, okay. Well, I mean, things will work out. Go and vote. Like that's not enough. Liberals need to be fully aware of the extent of the problem that we're facing right now. And the ways in which you can do that are very broad. You can go to more milquetoast stuff, like pointing out that Joe Biden could be weaponizing the DOJ more effectively, to more extreme stuff, like using this as a radicalizing incentive against capitalism and liberal democracy in general. Liberal democracies are doomed to fall into these cycles of ineptitude and abstemiousness because the absence of real activist driven political organization within any kind of democratic system leads to apathy and malaise. And again, this kind of contented, it will all work out ideal. The idea that it will never happen here is, in fact, the single greatest determiner that it will probably end up happening here. So try to get them on board with that, or not on board with that. Like the famed Twitter shit posters say. The They can't do that. Posters are have yet to find a counter to the Republicans' response, which is "lol, we'll do it anyway." In terms of arguments, you can be fractally more detailed, but that's it for that. I think it's also very important on a personal level to protect yourself. If the worst comes to worse, and we see legitimate civil conflict as a product of Republicans weaponizing our faltering democracy to begin purging dissidents. And that's not super unlikely at all. We have an incredibly advanced surveillance state, especially within red states where, like, the state government would comply with any kind of uh, broader Republican project. The idea of like people getting like broadly rounded up is not at all that unlikely. Barr attempted or at least talked about bringing sedition charges against BLM protesters way back in like 2019, I think. That would have been monstrous and effectively like ignoring our First Amendment rights. But it's something they're willing to do. They've only gotten more radical since then. So to that end, people hate it when I say it, but yeah, I think you should buy guns. I think you should buy guns. I think you should train yourself in their use. I think you should stockpile a reasonable amount of ammunition, water, bean cans, and other emergency supplies. I'm not a prepper. You can look online for resources if you want. Um, the idea here is not that you're going to John Wick your way out of a fascist coup, only that in the grand scale of things, the idea of civil unrest becomes much more manageable when you and people in progressive areas around you are on average more likely to own firearms. Of course, if you are mentally unstable or you feel you can't uh, healthily possess a firearm, then that's to your discretion. Don't go doing anything that you consider unsafe. The idea of personally owning a firearm and using it in some kind of, heroic action movie sequence to defend yourself is largely a child's fantasy. Albeit one that people indulge in frequently and one that basically like sustains the entire American gun industry. For me, it's about community defense, you know? It's not, maybe one day you, an individual, are going to single-handedly march on Washington and end fascism, inshallah. But rather, that perhaps you live in a community that is relatively progressive, and if civil unrest ever becomes a possibility, I think that you'll sleep more safely at night, knowing that you and your neighbors who don't want you to die have the means to defend themselves if far-right militias ever make their way through their town, which is exactly what happened back during the BLM protests. The comparative lawlessness that was experienced in some areas as a product of the nonstop protesting and limited police resources led far-right groups to take their shot. And if the far right groups are ever taking their shot to the point where they're, say, driving through like minority communities and like shooting at people in the streets, I know this sounds incredibly hyperbolic, but I'm simplifying a bit. In reality, violence like this tends to escalate over a moderate to long period of time, and I can't really simplify the factors involved because I don't know the factors involved. I'm spitting hypotheticals. Nonetheless, many such examples throughout history. And in these cases, I think it's better that communities full of people who do not want to have people killed based on their skin color or their political affiliation, for wanting democracy or whatever, that they be, you know, capable of defending themselves. Likewise, know your neighbors. Seriously, this is even more important than owning a gun or whatever else. Knowing your neighbors, having a brief conversation with them. I don't mean go over there and be like, can you buy a gun to protect yourself, to protect our neighborhood? Like, don't be a freak, But having a conversation with them, bake them some brownies, weed optional. Knowing your neighbors can make a critical difference in many times of crises, whether that be civil unrest or an earthquake or a tornado. It can mean the difference between you and the people in your house being injured and being left to your own devices as your healthy neighbors run to a safer place, or them stopping to check on you first, or vice versa, you to them. It is critical that you know the people who you live around. Um, and if you really want to protect yourself, it is also important, I think, to keep your secrets and to stay anonymous. Signal, I think, is a fairly good encrypted app, though I'm not much of a techie guy. So, maybe somebody in the comments below will be like, actually, Signal was bought by the feds in 19. And, yeah, anything you send there goes basically like straight to the DSA. Yeah, like, um, whatever. Um, sorry. Do your research. I should post on Twitter anonymously. It's too late for me. People know I'm a lefty. But things ever go really bad. Wouldn't hurt. Likewise, looking into travel options wouldn't hurt. Last, I think that you must organize. I have been encouraging DSA participation more recently, not because I agree with everything the DSA is, are, or represent, but rather because we do not have the time to build from the ground up an entirely new socialist political organization. And I think that it would be much more effective to make better the platforms we already have. The DSA is a very diverse organization full of people and behaviors that I have no doubt that I would cringe at. But you can make it better. Just don't tell them that I sent you. I actually got an email once from somebody who said that my name came up in a DSA interview. Uh, so that's something. Attend protests, but don't bring your phone. If you're on the street and you see cops doing something, record them. There's an app that you can get from the ACLU. It's Justice something. Justice is one of the two words in the name that allows you to record police interactions and live stream those to an ACLU server, meaning that even if your phone gets taken from you, the evidence remains archived on their servers. So the cops can't store your phone and delete it. Um, just a good strategy in general. So be careful about that. You know, I hate to say it, voting is still important. I would actually say that voting is actually critically important, not because Democrats are capable of solving our problems, they're not, but rather because they occupy space. They're like a bulbous gray mass that, when present, a Republican cannot take their seat. It's really that simple, you know. Take it, Republican right wing fascist versus Democrat, inept gray matter. Even the most cynical attitudes towards Democrats beget a perspective which reveals them to be infinitely preferable to the modern day Republican Party. Likewise, state control of the state legislators and governorships and what have you have long been biased towards Republicans because the only nerds who vote in state elections are old people who tend to be Republican. That will need to change, especially since the Supreme Court's current strategy towards turning our country into a ruinous hellhole is leaving everything to the states, including whether or not you have rights. So, it wouldn't hurt to win that over and get liberals involved. Please remember that leftists on their own are incapable of solving problems that involve things as big as the federal government, especially on this scale. We just aren't enough of us, you know? But much in the same way that the far right fascists are capable of ringleading around their more moderate, George Bush era neocon type followers, so too are leftists capable of being ringleaders. That is, in fact, us at our best. Many leftists delude themselves into believing that socialist goals are achieved through socialist action. But that's always a bit simplistic. A world composed entirely of non liberal political radicals at the moment is unlikely and unfeasible. The smarter solution, in actuality, is to maintain a convincing hold over the hearts and minds of the liberal population, to convince them that our struggles are their struggles, to convince them that our causes are their causes, to make them see our arguments and value our perspective. And maybe then we can lighten the load off our backs a little bit, because there are not enough of us to make these big changes, but there are many, many, many more of them. And that is, at the moment, frankly, the only feasible uh, method by which leftists can achieve their goals at a level of, of that scale. Oh, I am sorry. I am very sick. I'm trying to recover. I wanted to make this video, in part because I had to be productive with something today, but also because I wanted to correct some of the attitudes present in my audience. It's always with the doomer stuff, I've said this many times before, and I will say it again, and it's as simple as this, really. I would go so far as to say that the majority of people who have died throughout human history have died believing they were seeing the end times. Whether we're talking, the fall of Rome or the villages overrun by Genghis Khan, millions and billions of people throughout history have died thinking this is it, it's over, humanity's been good up till this point, but This is one of the reasons why so many religions constantly predict, or at least talk extensively about, the probability of doomsday in the near future. And it's just because people, I think, there are many cognitive biases that people, um, well, I mean, we're literally born with them. Our brains aren't perfect to an extent, and they train us to think in certain ways. And I think that biases that we have towards individual experience, nostalgia, and anxieties people tend to hold about the future, which can bias their perspective against other things they know have happened in the past. It creates this atemporal fear of things, of a protagonist syndrome. You're watching it all fall down, but everyone believes they've watched it fall down. You know? I've said this before too, but remember the hard work of the union organizers and the socialists and the anarchists in America's late 19th and 20th centuries. Were it not for their hard work, we would not have the weekend, 40-hour work weeks, and end child labor. They fought and they often died or lost in their time, but we enjoy the fruits of their labor. A lot of these men lived wretched, miserable lives, shacked up in tenements, choked by the black smog of the factories that they lived nearby and worked at. And they would die at 35, and they would, I don't know, how did people die back then? Leprosy? Probably not leprosy. Cholera? I have no idea. And they'd only have one leg. Feel pity for the men and the women. And the non-binary early 20th, the non-binary Gilded Age union workers. I'm sure there was at least one. Godspeed to them too. A lot of them died, or at least suffered, before they saw anything real come about from their efforts. If they had just given up, then what would we have today? What would any of us have today if everyone with a good idea just gave up because they realized they would be facing insurmountable odds? It just doesn't work that way. In America, especially in the West, we were all born expecting things to be easier for us than they were for our parents and grandparents, right? And then that kind of fell out from under us. The millennials and Gen Z, our relative rate of home ownership and wealth accumulation, has gone down. Houses too expensive, wages not kept up with inflation or productivity, etc., etc. So we're going to get a worse hand. And you know what? Yeah, we are. We are going to get a worse hand in many respects. But is it worse than, you know, the silent generation or the generation before them? Is it so bad that it is impossible for human spirit to overcome? Absolutely not. So take pride in the work that you do, despite bad circumstances. Remember to make arguments in favor of the things you believe, because the things you believe are worth arguing for. Remember to work within the channels that can bring about effective outcomes, even if that means compromise, because at the moment we are not in a position where we can be that picky with the methods by which we oppose a fascist coup in the United States. And protect yourself. In case something should happen, it is always better to be prepared, not because it will guarantee your safety. Nobody's safety is ever guaranteed anywhere at any time from anything. That's just not how the world works. But because, on average, it will make you and the people around you just that much safer. Going to go drink some water.